Good morning, everyone, and welcome to lecture 6 of Emma. I think it's 6, 7, 8. Yes, that's right. So today we're going to start with some interesting articles about Austen, and particularly about Emma. This is about the social hierarchy. This is in a book by Oliver McDonough, and it's entitled Real and Imagined Worlds. I like the cover of it because it shows the woman's dress. And maybe it's Emma. We're not really sure. It doesn't tell us. But anyway, um, this is about the social traffic in Emma. That's the title. This is chapter 6, and just some interesting points. There are at least two interesting differences between Emma and the rest of Jane Austen's completed work. First, it operates with fewer active, or at any rate fewer speaking characters than any of the other novels. Only 16 of the 90 or so people who appear in the book actually speak directly. I didn't realize that, but that's true. There are about 90 people, and only a select handful speaks. Two of these, Mrs. Ford, the proprietress of the draper's shop, and Mrs. Bates, the vicar's widow, contribute no more than a humdrum sentence or two to provide continuity in a particular scene. In a third case, Mrs. Cole's more lengthy passage, the object is merely to set up for discussion the mystery of Jane Fairfax's pianoforte. That pianoforte is going to keep coming back. For all practical purposes, there are only 13 speaking parts in what is a full-length play, quote unquote, on play. 3 Knightleys, 2 Westons, 2 Woodhouses, 2 Eltons, Miss Bates, Jane Fairfax, Frank Churchill, and Harriet Smith. The fewness of speakers is not immediately apparent, which I think is true. Instead, one gets the impression of a crowded stage. I think the reason for this illusion is that Jane Austen uses reported speech, especially extensively, in Emma. At least 35 of the characters who do not actually say anything in the book have their observations reported by one or other of the dozen or so actual participants. The purpose, or at any rate the effect, is to engender a sense of social density and incessant social traffic without cluttering up the narrative or distracting attention from the selected patterns of interplay. A second peculiarity of Emma is contradistinction to any of the other Jane Austen writing is that the entire action is practically confined to a single place. And I've noted that before, but I think it's particularly noteworthy because within this little social circle is contained all in Highbury. This author goes on to say the social arrangement of the village is, of course, hierarchical, and they talk about it all the time. Some interesting observations about particular characters. We're going to see Mr. Elton playing a part. He takes his rank from his clerical office. He is not formally and is superficially a gentleman. Let's see that. I think that's all I wanted to include from this. Oh no, here's something. Were the Woodhouses to limit themselves to their equals, and in Emma's estimation, only Donwell, Mr. Knightley's place, and Randall's, the Weston's house, belonged to the regular and best families, Emma would have to be practically confined to Hartfield. So she talks a lot about social rank and how people fit in, she meaning Emma. And I think that's all I was going to include. So that was one article. And I think I mentioned this book early on, but believe it or not, it has some really good information. Um, Jane Austen for Dummies. What it does, sometimes I don't like the dummy books because the tone is a little jokey, but um, still, it makes some really good observations. For example, this is a chapter about looking at ladies' limited rights and roles. And we certainly have seen that in other classes, but it's a relevant part of Austen's novels. Um, the subtitle is Living as a Lady in a Gentleman's World. Because a female had no legal or economic rights in Austen's day, she had to be careful when choosing a husband. For in surrendering her money and her rights to her husband, um, she wanted to be sure as she could that he would treat her with respect, fairness, and love. No law required him to do so. In fact, the law gave him the right not to do so. Ladies lived with a set of customs that denied them a great deal. Consequently, women were dependent on men. Ladies' legal rights were minimal. Under the law, a lady could not do things that women today take for granted. She could not vote. Women didn't get the right to vote in this country until 1920. She could not attend university. She could not enter a profession. She could not control her money and property, including her children and her clothes. Rarely did a married lady hold property in her own name. Um, More frequently, a lady's one option for securing her own property was to place it in a trust. Her husband had control of their children, control over their sex life. Her husband could demand it and even rape or commit adultery. The husband had the right to hit her. Even if the husband locked her up in the attic, beat her, denied her access to her children, and emotionally abused her, she was his property, and so he could do as he liked. Isn't that interesting? And I think I read on that, oh, I know I did, on the first day about women escaping the gilded cage in this country by going out west to what was it, South Dakota. Um, a father owned his daughters literally. So this gives us insight into Mr. Woodhouse and his relationship with Isabella, the older daughter, and Emma. He was in charge of housing, clothing, and feeding her. As a gentleman, he was responsible for seeing to it that she had the dowry money, money that her mother or even her father brought to the table prior to their marriage, to secure a good husband. But he was required by law. But was he required by law to supply a dowry? No. A girl of a genteel class hoped and trusted that her parents' marriage settlement, money that her parents brought to the table back when their families' lawyers negotiated the finances of their marriage, included a dowry money for her future marriage. Her father's wise use of this money would leave his children, younger sons, and widow comfortably provided for. A father, except in the case of the clergy, and we will talk about the Bateses in a bit. A father who had failed to use the money settlement carefully was pretty much considered a failure as a father. For a young lady of the gentry, her dowry was key to marrying well. And remember that Emma has 30,000 pounds, and presumably Isabella had the same. We'll talk about Mr. John Knightley too. Um, so belonging to Daddy may have been a comforting for a time, but if Papa failed to think ahead financially, his daughters or even his younger sons faced financial problems in the future, and the situation was worse for the daughters. Um, Mr. Woodhouse does provide for his daughters, and Emma's parents' finances were such that she is worth 30,000 pounds, making her quite rich. Okay, let's see. There's a note here about becoming an accomplished lady, and in our case, Jane Fairfax is quite accomplished, but she is destined to move on to become a governess. Nearly all the families in the gentry class had their own copies of Fordyce and Gregory to give their daughters an education on manners, and they also educated their daughters to become quote unquote accomplished women. Female education took various forms as no standard curriculum existed for women. Girls normally started their education at home with penmanship and reading, taught by their mothers or governesses. To this beginning, sewing, um, which is often referred to in our novel as work, and we see Mrs. Bates, the widow of a former of a clergyman. She does knitting. Knitting was considered um, a lower form of needlework. Um, Women often were taught basic arithmetic and homemaking. Homemaking didn't include scrubbing the floors or cooking. Servants and staff in the house did that for the gentry. Their education and manners constantly evolved as well as they read the guidebook at times and applied the advice to their lives. Interestingly enough, in Austen's novels, the most uninteresting ladies are frequently the products of the most expensive educations. Um, Defining what is an accomplished woman, society expected women of the gentry to have certain social skills and talents so they could be good wives, mothers, and hostesses for their husbands' estates. Austen recites these expectations in Pride and Prejudice. Let's see, was there a reference to? Mm, A highly fashionable way to educate one's daughters was to hire a governess, a female tutor who lived in the house. Remember poor Miss Taylor, who then went on to marry Weston. They lived this live-in staff member accomplished two goals. The family had both a live-in educator and a female companion or chaperone for the girls when they went for walks, carriage rides, and so on. So the Campbells certainly did this for their daughter, in the person of Jane Fairfax, and then that daughter, the Campbell daughter, went on to marry Dixon, and we know how that's going to play out. Many girls with governesses had all their education at home until they were well into their teens. The subjects would be the same as at the seminaries or boarding schools, and again, special masters could be hired to supplement the girls' education in dancing, music, and art. And we see often Jane Fairfax's ability to play the pianoforte, is notably more superior than Emma's. Okay, what else? I thought this chapter was very interesting. It's chapter 9, by the way, in this dummy book. Okay, I think that's all I was going to show you. Oh no, there's one thing. Um, this is an aside about the loneliness of the governess. Victorian painter Richard Redgrave's painting The Governess, done in 1845, and in the collection of London's Victoria and Albert Museum, touchingly depicts the governess's plight. In it, we see a young woman seated in the shadow at a piano where the music for Home Sweet Home sits on the music rack. Dressed in a heavy black dress with a modest white collar, it is clearly meant to suggest a nun's habit. She holds a letter in her hand and looks forlorn. But in the background, dressed in pastels and in the sunlight, are the young girls, not that much younger than she is, whom she teaches. The difference in the young ladies' situations and futures are clear in the painting as described. The typical governess of the day isn't the happy and beloved Miss Taylor, um, Emma's governess, who, as Emma grows up, becomes less of a governess than a friend. Indeed, their relationship had the intimacy of sisters. And that's right from the text in chapter 1. Miss Taylor's life is so unusual for a governess that she even becomes a member of the gentry. She marries Mr. Weston, who owns the Randalls' estate, and she and Emma carry on as if they're sisters, instead of governess and former student. Austen shows society's perception of the governess when Mrs. Elton, albeit vulgar, registers surprise that Miss Taylor, now Mrs. Weston, a former governess, is so very ladylike, quite the gentlewoman. We'll get to that passage today. You gotta love Mrs. Elton. She is just left of center in her vulgarity. Let's see if I have anything else today. Oh yeah, we'll get to this in a second. Um, Mrs. Elton, interesting character. So let's go to the text. Did I finish this one? Um, so we left off on page 214. We'll start on page 215, and there's more. This is chapter 9 in volume 2. Um, the chapter is really devoted to character revelation, and we see a lot of that through conversation and through Emma's perception of them. Emma, it begins, and the sentence kind of surprised me. Emma did not repent her condescension in going to the Coles. Now, what that reveals is how Emma looks down on the Coles because Emma sees her position as being superior to virtually everybody in Highbury. Next paragraph, in the same paragraph, she was able, by going to the Coles and condescending to them, she didn't regret that because it enhanced her popularity. I love that. It must be amply repaid in the splendor of popularity. And then paragraph 2, perfect happiness, even in memory, is not common. And there were 2 points on which she was not quite easy. She had betrayed a couple of paragraphs ago, a couple of chapters ago, what she thought to Churchill about Jane Fairfax. She has suspicion of Jane Fairfax's feelings to Frank Churchill. She reveals this to Frank. Now, if you've read this novel before, you may recall how the plot is going to unfold. I think I can go one more day without revealing too much of the plot, but remember what I said last week about this being a detective story. It absolutely is, and Austen drops clues. And if you know what happens, you can pick up those clues. If you don't know what happens at the end of the plot, you may miss the clues. And they are revealed quite apparently in this chapter. She says it was hardly right, but it had been so strong an idea that it would escape her, and his submission to all that she told was a compliment to her penetration, which made it difficult for her to be quite certain that she ought to have held her tongue. And always note the clues that Austen gives us about Emma's creation of ideas. Next paragraph. The other geez, I can't even say that word. The other circumstance of regret related also to Jane Fairfax. And there she had no doubt. She did unfeignedly and unequivocally regret the inferiority of her own playing and singing. And Emma, we know, flits from one idea to another, flits from one task to another. And here we see her practicing her piano for an hour and a half because she so dislikes being inferior to Jane Fairfax. We go to page 216. The last sentence of the second paragraph towards the top. Mr. Frank Churchill talked a great deal about your taste, that he valued taste much more than execution. That's a really interesting, subtle comparison between taste and execution. Clearly, Jane Fairfax has execution on her side. And Harriet, not so much. She doesn't like Italian opera because she can't understand it because it's in Italian. Just going to say. But then let's see. There's a reference here to Mr. Martin. Remember, Martin was the one who wanted to marry Harriet, and Emma persuaded Harriet to not go with Mr. Martin because he was presumably beneath Harriet, which is false because poor Harriet doesn't have, she came from nobody. Down at the bottom, uh, she said he was very agreeable that day and he dined there. He sat by her at dinner. Miss Nash thinks either of the Coxes would be very glad to marry him. Constant references to marrying people off. There were no such things as long engagements. One married somebody from one's own social class, and one also paid attention to who is in your immediate age group. Um, Emma and Harriet go off to town. Harriet, we see, this is a really good example of Harriet's um, a little dimness. She goes off and wants to buy gloves, but um, top of page 217. Harriet, tempted by everything and swayed by half a word, was always very long at the procedure or at the purchase. And while she was still hanging over muslins and changing her mind, Emma went to the door for amusement. So, um, girls at the time, of course, went escorted. So Harriet is going off to purchase something at this little mercantile, and Emma thinks it's expedient for Emma to go with Harriet in case they run into the Martins again because she needs to send Harriet away from the Martins. So there's a passage. This is the larger paragraph on page 217, in which we see the townspeople just walking by the shop door. At the end of this paragraph, a mind lively and at ease can do with seeing nothing and can see nothing that does not answer. So, in other words, Emma has the quickness of mind to think about the people she's seeing. Okay, everybody in this chapter needs to go and take a look at the pianoforte. Not a whole lot happens in this town, I'm just going to say. So the big news on the horizon is that Jane Fairfax is sent a pianoforte, and everybody is speculating where it came from. Captain Campbell, perhaps? Or Dixon, perhaps? We don't know. So down at the bottom of page 218, Harriet can't really decide. We see her in a big fuddle. Over on page 219, in the middle of the page, Harriet can't decide, and she says, "Oh, but I indeed would much rather have it in one, and if you please, you shall send it to Mrs. Goddard's. I don't know. I don't know, Miss Woodhouse, I may just as well have it sent to Hartfield." Emma says, "That you do not give another half second to the subject. To Hartfield, if you please, Mrs. Ford." So even Emma realizes that Harriet's a little dim. Um, and then down at the bottom of page 219, Very well, I am much obliged to you. My mother is delightfully well, and Jane caught no cold last night. I'm not even sure why. Why did I make that one? How was Mr. That we don't need to know that one. Um, but yes, we do. I, they're talking to the Bateses, and Miss Bates, the younger, talks incessantly. And I think Austen's gift is character development. Miss Bates talks on page 220 for the entire page, flitting from the spectacles to baked apples to a shocking breakfast to apple dumplings, all in a huge paragraph. It made me laugh. Page 221, Miss Bates is interrupted, and then she says, "What was I talking of?" Said she, beginning again when they were all in the street. Emma wondered on what of all the medley she could fix. It's a medley. I think that was just hilarious. And then she talks about the glasses again, and the rivet of the glasses, um, and Mr. Knightley's liberal supply of baked apples. He has an orchard, and she goes on again, another medley. He talks about William. She talks about William Larkins, who is the foreman of Knightley's estate, and then she refers to Patty, her maid, and again in a giant paragraph. And I think it's really hilarious. Um, I'm sure all of you have a friend or somebody who talks too much. I do. Her name is Melanie, and she talks a lot. Um, kind, kind soul, but still talks like Miss Bates. At the top of page 223, Miss Bates had just done as Patty opened the door, and her visitors walked upstairs without having any regular narration to attend to. Kind of an ironic little flip reference to the fact that she talks too much. Um, but then there's an interesting passage here, just a reference to the dark staircases. Staircases at the time were in fact dark because there weren't any lights in them, and generally speaking, no windows. So it says down at the end of this chapter, just kind of an interesting tidbit. Rather, the staircase was rather darker and narrower than one could wish, as would be all staircases, and they were probably carrying candles. Next chapter, chapter 10, um, Mrs. Bates, since she doesn't have her glasses, since they're broken, I don't know if you can see mine, but mine are broken too. I sat on them more than once. The appearance of the little sitting room as they entered was tranquility itself. Mrs. Bates, deprived of her usual employment, which was knitting, was slumbering on one side of the fire, and Frank Church at the table near her, most deedily occupied about her spectacles, and Jane Fairfax standing with her back to them, intent on her pianoforte. This chapter is loaded with hints from Jane Austen. So we have this little group, and um, you we walk in, and Jane is over there, and um, Frank is over here working with the glasses, and Mrs. Bates is sound asleep. And he says, Mrs. Weston says, "What? Have you not finished it yet? What's taking you so long with the glasses?" "I have not been working uninterruptedly," he said. "I have been assisting Miss Fairfax in trying to make her instrument stand steadily. It was not quite firm, an unevenness in the floor, I believe," not wanting to place blame on the pianoforte. But there's a hint here, some underlying interaction. You have to watch these. And then at the bottom of this page, That she was not immediately ready, Emma did suspect to arise from the state of her nerves. She had not yet possessed the instrument long enough to touch it without emotion. She must reason herself into the power of performance. Oh, that's an interesting little hint. Um, Jane isn't ready to play. Emma speculates it's because of nerves. What kind of nerves? Now remember, there's some underlying interaction going on here. Top of page 225. So whatever her nerves, whatever their origin, and could not but resolve never to expose them to her neighbor again. So the next paragraph, Emma joined her in all her praise, and the pianoforte, with ever proper discrimination, was pronounced to be altogether of the highest promise. And then the fiction of where the pianoforte came from continues. Next paragraph. Whoever Colonel Campbell might employ, said Frank Churchill, with a smile at Emma, the person has not chosen ill. So even he is participating in praising the pianoforte. And he says at the end, I dare say, Miss Fairfax, that he either gave his friend very minute directions or wrote to Broadwood himself. Do you not think so? Broadwood was the manufacturer of the pianoforte. So somebody has done his homework about the piano. Then down at the bottom of this page, I'm on 225. Conjecture. Sometimes one conjectures right, and sometimes one conjectures wrong. That is important, especially when we're talking about Emma, who often conjectures incorrectly. Pay attention to that. And then at the top of 226, Frank finishes fixing the glasses. Middle of the page, Frank says, what felicity it is to hear a tune again, which has made one happy. So Jane is playing something that he recognizes. If I mistake not, that was danced at Weymouth. Now remember that they have known each other since they were both at this resort town. Next paragraph. Very thoughtful of Colonel Campbell, was not it? He knew Miss Fairfax could have no music here. I honor that part of the attention particularly. It shows that it shows it to have been so thoroughly from the heart. Nothing hastily done, nothing incomplete. True affection only could have prompted it. Next paragraph. Emma wished he would be less pointed, yet could not help being amused, and when, on glancing her eye towards Jane Fairfax, she caught the remains of a smile, and when she saw that, with all the deep blush of consciousness, there had been a smile of secret delight. Of course, Emma conjectures, may be right, may be wrong. This amiable, upright, perfect Jane Fairfax was apparently cherishing very reprehensible feelings. Emma deduces that Jane is blushing and smiling because she's thinking about Dixon, who Emma believes Jane is having an affair with. Top of 227. You speak too plain. She must understand you. I hope she does. I would have her understand me. I am not in the least ashamed of my meaning, says he. But really, I'm half ashamed and wish I had never taken up the idea. So she does regret having blabbed her conjecture to Frank. That's how the chapter 9 began. I have now a key to all her odd looks and ways. Leave shame to her. If she does wrong, she ought to feel it. Okay, then over on the top of page 228, the listeners were amused, and Mrs. Weston gave Emma a look of particular meaning, but Emma still shook her head in steady skepticism. So we see Emma doing this constantly. conjecturing and then committing yourself to the conjecture. So then Mr. Knightley comes in, and again, a little bit of development about him because he is offering to do errands for the Bateses. And the Bateses, of course, have depressed means because Mrs. Bates's husband was a clergyman and now she only has a very small income. Oh, Mr. Knightley, what a delightful party last night. How extremely pleasant. Did you ever see such dancing? Was it not delightful? Miss Woodhouse and Mr. Frank Churchill. I never saw anything equal to it. Um, it the real important part is that Mr. Knightley has come to do a service for the Bateses. And we take these little bits, his generosity towards others, um, even his treatment um, of Martin, one of his tenant farmers. He also had sent them a big bag of his orchard apples, which they are using to supplement their diet. So, an interesting thing about this is a fun fact to know and tell. At the time, people thought that eating raw fruit was not good for oneself. One cooked the apples. And perhaps you've had a baked apple. They're really quite delicious, especially if you supplement the flavor with brown sugar. But they are thanking Knightley for not only his willingness to do an errand for them, um, but also for sending them a big bag of apples. Yes, said Jane, we heard his kind offers, and we heard everything. Um, Next chapter. Much discussion about this ball, the dance ball, not the ball that Daphne's pushing on me. I don't know if you see me move every once in a while, but Daphne keeps pushing balls into my lap. So here is something very interesting about these balls, these dances. Um, this is by um, Professor Catherine Sutherland. We've seen articles by her before. She's very astute, and she is. This is a film, but the abstract of it gives us insight into why this ball is so important. It's entitled Jane Austen, Public and Private Space. Very little social behavior happens in private in this world. There are always lookers on. Jane Austen's novels show both that women, particularly, have very little freedom, but also everybody has very little freedom because we're all being watched by somebody. Most of our activities are happening in a kind of halfway public private place, and they're always subject to gossip. I am sure that you have realized how much gossip is going on. There's nothing else to do. Um, the to a kind of watchfulness and to judgment, of course. And these are the things that she herself is particularly interested in exploring. We're so used to thinking of Jane Austen as a modern novelist in her concerns for love, but it's worth remembering that especially women in Jane Austen's day had extremely restricted freedoms, and young women and young men had very limited opportunities for courtship and for meeting under private circumstances. Remember how we opened today with Frank over here, Jane over there, and Mrs. taking a nap, Mrs. Bates. Um, Dancing with a partner a certain number of times was a way of indicating that you were interested. It was a chance to flirt. It was a chance to be more serious. It was though a limited kind of freedom. We should remember that these are highly stylized dances. Very little opportunity for actual bodily contact, holding hands, linking arms as you moved up and down the row of the dance. But there weren't any really close physical contact, so limited opportunities for dance. On the other hand, dancing together was one of the signals you sent both to your partner and to everyone else that you were interested. And yet, And if you danced more than a certain number of dances together, then the chances were that you were moving towards something very serious. So, um, we'll get to this when they start discussing the dance, the ball, that the dances usually lasted about 15 minutes, and one danced two dances, and then one moved on. But if one wanted to convey that you were interested, then you might consent to dance more. Um, so I just thought that that was really interesting because there is a lot of talk about the ball. Um, it may be possible this chapter opens on page 230 to do without dancing entirely. Instances have been known of young people passing many, many months successively without being at any ball of any description, and no material injury accrue either to body or mind. But when a beginning is made, when the felicities of rapid motion have once been, though slightly felt, it must be a very heavy set that does not ask for more. And what we're going to see in here is that Frank Churchill, I keep calling him Church, and it's Churchill. Um, we know that um, Frank refers to when Jane and he were at Weymouth, and Frank Church had danced once at Highbury and longed to dance again. And the last half hour of an evening, which Mr. Woodhouse was persuaded to spend with his daughter at Randall's, was passed by the two young people in schemes on their subject. Frank was the first. Frank's was the first idea. So the idea to have a ball is coming from Frank. Why do we think Frank wants a dance? Well, of course, Emma's going to surmise incorrectly. Um, at the bottom of page 230, her first proposition and request that the dance begun at Mr. Cole's should have finished there, that the same parties should be collected and the same musician engaged, met with the readiest acquiescence. And then we go to the top of the page 231. There's a list of the people who would be invited, and it's the usual folks, it's the best folks, even though Emma thinks the Coxes are below them. Um, so they would have at least 10 people. And was it the Coxes who had a new dining room table? I think so. And therefore they had room for 10 people. At the bottom of page 231, um, is this Mr. Woodhouse? This guy is just hilarious. Um, Towards the bottom, Mr. Woodhouse opposed it earnestly on the score of health. It made him so very unhappy indeed that it could not be persevered in. Um, I think one of the things that Austen does particularly well is create these characters that we may all know. Um, I I bet you I mean I know somebody who is always concerned about her health. Always. And it's just it always comes back in Mr. Woodhouse, always comes back to the fact that he defines himself as an invalid. Oh no, said he, it would be the extreme of imprudence. I could not bear it for Emma. Emma is not strong. She would catch a dreadful cold. Well, Emma is strong, and we know that. But the obsession that Mr. Woodhouse has with catching cold isn't just his extreme concern with his health. Catching a cold at the time was potentially fatal. Pneumonia, you couldn't cure pneumonia. We see that Harriet catches a cold and um, needs to restrict herself from the evening's festivities. But Jane also caught a cold and apparently never recovered. Um, and Jane's mother died of TB. So, top of page 232, we have Frank trying to create a situation in the dance. Mrs. Weston, you would be quite laid up. Do not let them talk of such a wild thing. Pray do not let them talk of it. That young man, speaking lower, is very thoughtless, Frank, for trying to create this dance. Now, he's pretty motivated. You'll notice this. He's very motivated to have this ball take place at the bottom of 232. Emma perceived that the nature of his gallantry was a little self-willed, and that he would rather oppose than lose the pleasure of dancing with her. You have to laugh. Emma thinks that Frank is smitten with her, Emma, and that's why he wants the dance. Had she intended ever to marry him, it might have been worthwhile to pause and consider and try to understand the value of his preference and the character of his temper. But for all the purposes of their acquaintance, he was quite amiable enough. So she has again conjectured. We get a hint here. It's a clue. But now they think, well, the Randall house, the Weston's house, may not be big enough, so they speculate about the Crown Inn. I mean, this discussion of having a ball goes on for quite a while, down at the bottom of page 233. No, he thought it very far from an improvement. A very bad plan, much worse than the other. A room at the inn was always damp and dangerous. This is Mr. Woodhouse's thoughts about having a dance at the inn. It was never properly aired or fit to be inhabited. Um, if they must dance, they had better dance at Randall's. Don't forget, we are told early on that Mr. Woodhouse does not like change. So having at first first he says that the dance is a bad idea, and then when it gets changed from Randall House to the inn, it's a bad idea. He had never been in the room at the Crown in his life, did not know the people who kept it by sight. Oh no, a very bad plan. They would catch worse colds at the Crown than anywhere. It's just so typical of Mr. Woodhouse. Um, There's a reference in the next paragraph to Mr. Perry. If you've forgotten who that is, that's that apothecary. And then in the next paragraph, it is that dreadful habit of opening the windows, letting in cold air upon heated bodies, which, as you well know, does the mischief. There's that myth about going outside with wet hair that you will definitely catch your death of cold. It's right here. But you can't really blame um, the commitment to this myth because there was nothing about viruses. There's certainly no antibiotics. Um, Down at the bottom of page 234. Oh, interrupted Emma. There will be plenty of time for talking everything over. There is no hurry at all. If it can be contrived to be at the Crown, Papa, it will be very convenient for the horses. They will be so near their own table. I marked that because that's Emma's role. She persuades him. She guides him into right thinking. So, of course, she persuades Mr. W to go along with the ball because at the inn, because that's where the horses would be better. And he says, but is Mrs. Stokes to be trusted? I doubt it. I do not know her, even by sight. And then there's a reference to, in the middle of the page, to the measles. This was something that became rampant. There were no vaccinations. Um, so Emma had the measles. Of course, if you had the measles or if you have any experience with it, you know that one of the things that can be devastating about it is the fever. There was no way to control it, of course. Um, and it's just, I think it was a nice little insight into the period. At the top of page 236, "My dear, you are too particular," said her husband. "What does all that signify? You will see nothing of it by candlelight. It will be as clean as Randall's by candlelight. We never see anything of it at our club nights." That's Mr. Weston. Mrs. is being way too particular about the cleanliness of the place. And I think it's funny that he says it's going to be by candlelight. Nobody's going to even notice it, which is probably true. Um, I have something written in the margin. I don't know what it is. Mrs. Weston, down at the bottom of 236, proposed having no regular supper, merely sandwiches, etc., set out in the little room. But that was scouted out as a wretched suggestion. A private dance without sitting down to supper was pronounced an infamous fraud upon the rights of men and women. Um, and there's a little bit of irony, and Mrs. Weston must not speak of it again. She then took another line of expediency, and looking into the doubtful room, observed, "It is, oh, what did she observe? I do not think it is so very small. We shall not be many, you know." So they're talking and talking and talking about this ball, and I kept thinking to myself, they don't have anything else to do. But Frank is really, really pushing it. And Emma thinks it's because Frank is smitten with Emma, but that may not be the case. Middle of 237. "You will get nothing to the purpose from Miss Bates," said Emma. "She will be all delight and gratitude, but she will tell you nothing. She will not even listen to your question. I see no advantage in consulting Miss Bates." So Emma's pretty forthright about the fact that Miss Bates talks so much. But the interesting thing here is that Emma says she will not say anything, but we get a lot of clues from Miss Bates, even though she has absolutely no idea what she's saying. We do have to pay attention to what she observes at the top of, or the bottom of page 237. "The old lady, no, the young lady, to be sure. I think you a great blockhead, Frank, if you bring the aunt without the niece." Jane. "Oh, I beg your pardon, sir. I did not immediately recollect. Undoubtedly, if you wish it, I will endeavor to persuade them both." And away he ran. So he's manufactured the situation whereby Miss Bates and Jane will now be consulted about the venue. He didn't suggest that Jane be brought along. Somebody else did. I forget who. Mr. Weston. Yes. Um, at, at the end of this chapter on page 238, "Most cordially, when Miss Bates arrived, did she agree that it must. As a counselor, she was not wanted, but as an approver, a much safer character, she was truly welcome. Her approbation, at once general and minute, warm and incessant, could not but please, and for another half hour they were all walking to and fro between the rooms, some suggesting, some attending, and all in happy enjoyment." Next chapter. So what the discussion continues about the ball. One thing that begins, one thing only was wanting to make the prospect of the ball completely satisfactory to Emma. It's being fixed for a day within the granted term of Frank Churchill's stay in Surrey. So she's still going on this conjecture that he's after her, but he is called back to his um, aunt's home, which is where he lives. And the aunt is another entertaining character because she is also devoted to her health, but she's crabby. Um, let's see, on the top of the next page. Um, so this is about a third of the way down. "There was a great deal of a friendly and compassionate attachment on his side, but no love." Um, I'm not even sure what I meant by that. Um, let's see what the whole paragraph. It was not to oblige Jane Fairfax, therefore, that he would have preferred the society of William Larkin. No, um, she was more and more convinced that Mrs. Weston was quite mistaken in that surmise. I marked it for some reason, but I didn't write it down. So here we see, bottom of page 240. Um, the substance of this letter was forwarded to Emma in a note from Mrs. Weston instantly. As to his going, it was inevitable. He must be gone within a few hours, though without feeling any real alarm for his aunt to lessen his repugnance. He knew her illnesses. They never occurred but for her own contrivance. That's the aunt. So she's she's another one like Mr. Woodhouse, but Mr. Woodhouse is milder in his insistence about his health. The top of 241. So the ball is done. The loss of the ball, the loss of the young man, and all that the young man might be feeling, it was too wretched. Next paragraph, her father's feelings were quite distinct. He thought principally of Mrs. Churchill's illness. So they're kind of two peas in a pod. I think I had some notes um, about Mr. Woodhouse. I think he's hilarious. Um, yeah, here he is. This is in an article that I began last week from it's the introduction by Robert Bly, and he um, if you're interested in that article, it's the introduction to his the text of Emma. But as I warned you, there are a lot of spoiler alerts in there. But this one I think is interesting. Mr. Woodhouse married late and apparently without enthusiasm, and when his wife died after giving him two daughters, he seemed to have been able to transfer his backgammon playing, gossiping affection to his children and their governess without much trouble. But when Isabella, his elder daughter, wed Mr. John Knightley, who is a lawyer in Brunswick Square, and the brother of his Donwell neighbor, he is to begin a sinister fantasy which led him to regard all marriages as deaths. Isn't that interesting? But he does. Poor Isabella, he talks, and poor Miss Taylor. He is timid and antisocial. The sooner every party breaks up, the better. He hates all change and demands that life be like his gruel, warm, cozy, and innocuous. That was early in the novel. Although his name is a byword for condescending thoughtfulness in Highbury, he's really thoroughly selfish. All his kindnesses tend to enhance his personal comfort and convenience. He is egotistical, says Bly, without activity or of mind or body. And then he says, but as he is only half alive and stands in the very way of all healthy and vital instincts which issue in marriage. Thus, Mr. Woodhouse, so wrongly and oddly regarded as an old pet by generations of readers, is actually a menace. And by not realizing this, Emma reveals just another aspect of her vulnerability. Isn't that curious? Um, in much of the literature, Mr. Woodhouse is just, a kindly gentleman, but in this case, his role is a little bit darker. Mr. Woodhouse has managed to get his own way, by recourse to the trivial. And it is the trivial which Emma evokes to defeat her father's power once and forever. I don't want to give away too much. Um, so, all right, we'll come back to that. All right, at the top of 241, her father's feelings were quite distinct. He thought principally, oh, I said that, Mrs. Churchill's illness. Um, And the next number of pages, number of paragraphs, oh, poor Ball must be quite given up. And then it's going to come back to us. I'm just going to assure you. 242 at the top. Do not we rather surpass your expectations? I'm sure we do. I am sure you did not expect to like us. She's saying, Emma is saying this to um, um, this is to Frank. Emma, let's see. You would not have been so long in coming if you had had a pleasant idea of Highbury. So remember that Frank hesitated in visiting his father and his new wife, who is Emma's governess, the Westons. And a few lines later, in short, said he, perhaps Miss Woodhouse, I think you can hardly be quite without suspicion. And down at the bottom, here we see Emma misreading the clues again. He was silent. He believed he was looking at her, probably reflecting on what she had said, and trying to understand the manner. She heard him sigh. It was natural for him to feel that he had cause to sigh. He could not believe her to be encouraging him. A few awkward moments passed, and he sat down again in a more determined manner, said, it was something to feel that all the rest of the time might be given to Hartford. My regard for Hartford is most warm. He stopped again, rose again. He stopped again, rose again, and seemed quite embarrassed. He was more in love with her than Emma had supposed. So, always when we are seeing Emma misread a situation, there is language in there like than she supposed, or imaginary, or imagination. But it's subtle. At the bottom of page 243, to, to complete every other recommendation, he had almost told her that he loved her. Well, what did he almost tell her? She speculates that Frank almost told her, Emma, that Frank loved Emma. A lot of pronouns in that sentence. What strength or what constancy of affection he might be subject to was another point, but at present she could not doubt his having a decidedly warm admiration, a conscious preference of herself. And this persuasion, joined to all the rest, made her think that she must be a little in love with him, in spite of every previous determination against it. So he loves me, then I could feel comfortable loving him back. I certainly must, said she. The sensation of listlessness, weariness, stupidity, this disinclination to sit down and employ myself, this feeling of everything's being dull and insipid about the house. I must be in love. That's a weird cause effect, isn't it? Really, we're wondering if she's just bored because the entertainment factor of Frank is now gone. Down at the bottom of page 244, um, those of you who have taken my classes before know that one of my favorite words in all of English is the word odious. And there it is. It was, I'm trying not to sneeze. It was some days before she saw Jane Fairfax, to judge of her honest regret in this woeful change. But when they did meet, her composure was odious. Jane's was. She had been particularly unwell, however, suffering from headache to a degree which made her aunt declare that had all the ball taken place, she did not think that Jane could have attended, and it was charity to impute some of her unbecoming indifference to the languor of ill health. Austen is dropping another hint here. Um, and poor, if Emma is a little stultified by the fact that Frank has left town because he was called home, we see the same kind of behavior in Jane. Um, but we don't know. But there's an interesting comparison there. Next chapter. Here's Emma's thoughts on Frank. Emma continued to entertain no doubt of her being in love. Her ideas only varied as to how much. At first, she thought it was a good deal. Afterwards, but a little. So he's gone. She's lost interest. A few lines later, she was still busy and cheerful, and pleasing as he was, she could yet imagine him to have faults. And further, though thinking of him so much, and as she sat drawing or working, forming 1,000 amusing schemes for the progress and close of their attachment, fancying interesting dialogues, and inventing, look at the language, inventing elegant letters, the conclusion of every imaginary declaration on his side was that she refused him. So there's 3 or 4 words that indicate that she's just spinning. She's spinning this fantasy, this fiction in her brain. But still, they were to part. When she became sensible of this, it struck her that she could not be very much in love. Down at the bottom of 245. In not one of all my clever replies, my delicate negatives, is there any allusion to making a sacrifice. I do suspect that he is not really necessary to my happiness. She's just so funny. Next page at the top. She is examining her responses to Frank. He is undoubtedly very much in love. Everything denotes it. Very much in love indeed. And when he comes again, if his affection continue, I must be on my guard and not to encourage it. No, if he had believed me at all to share his feelings, he would not have been so wretched. And if you've gotten to the more towards the end, you will know that we're being given another hint here about the imagination of Emma. The last line of this paragraph, for they say everybody is in love once in their lives, and I shall have been let off easily by loving Frank temporarily. So Frank writes to Mrs. Weston, his I get these characters, his father's new bride, the governess, Emma's old governess, top of page 247. I had not a spare moment on Tuesday, as you know, for Miss Woodhouse's beautiful little friend. Pray my excuses and adieus to her. This, Emma could not doubt, was all for herself. She's kind of a silly girl. Next paragraph. Gratifying, however, stimulative as was the letter, this is the letter from Frank, in material part, its sentiments, but yet she yet found when it was folded up and returned to Mrs. Weston that it had not added any lasting warmth, that she could still do without the writer, and that he must learn to do without her. Her intentions were unchanged. Her resolution of refusal only grew more interesting by the addition of a scheme for his subsequent consolation and happiness. His recollection of Harriet and the words which clothed it, beautiful little friend, suggested to her the idea of Harriet succeeding her in his affections. I I I love the little nuggets that Emma latches onto to create the next scheme. And here's the nugget. Now, Frank never even mentioned Harriet by name. So he had to refer to her as a beautiful little friend. For Harriet, it would be advantageous and delightful indeed. We cannot forget that Harriet came from nobody. She's illegitimate. I must not dwell on it, said she. I must not think of it. I know the danger of indulging such speculations, but stranger things have happened. And when we cease to care for each other as we do now, it will be the means of conferring us in that sort of true disinterested friendship which I can already look forward to with pleasure. So Next page, Mr. Elton appears with his bride. Poor Harriet. You sort of have to feel sorry for her. Sure enough, um, second paragraph, poor Harriet was in a flutter of spirits which required all the reasonings and soothings and attentions of every kind that Emma could give. Emma felt that she could not do too much for her, that Harriet had a right to all her ingenuity and all her patience, but it was heavy work to be forever convincing without producing any effect, forever agreed to without being able to make their opinions the same. So Emma's trying to talk Harriet into believing that Elton wasn't for her. But Emma had made a lot of effort, put a lot of effort into convincing Harriet that she did indeed um, have the affections of Mr. Elton. At the bottom, you're allowing yourself to be so occupied and so unhappy about Mr. Elton's marrying Harriet is the strongest reproach you can make me. You could not give me a greater reproof for the mistake I fell into. So she says, deceiving myself, I did very miserably deceive you. Yes, that's true. But now, as a way to get Harriet to let go of Mr. Elton, she turned it back on herself. You're doing me a disservice for not letting go of this. Yes, I made a mistake. Sorry. Page 249. This appeal to her affections did more than all the rest. The idea of wanting gratitude and consideration for Miss Woodhouse, whom she really loved extremely, made her wretched for a while. So Emma knew how to manipulate the situation. Down towards 240, at the bottom of 249, there is no charm equal to tenderness of heart, said she afterwards. There is nothing to be compared to it. Warmth and tenderness of heart, with an affectionate, open manner, will beat all the clearness of the head in the world for attraction. And then the last line of the chapter, 250. Oh, the coldness of Jane Fairfax. Harriet is worth 100 such. And for a wife, a sensible man's wife, it is invaluable. I mention no names, but happy the man who changes Emma for Harriet. That's so. That's what she thinks. In her imagination, she thinks up this scheme for Frank. Next chapter. Um, Second paragraph. Emma had feelings, less of curiosity than of pride or propriety, to make her resolve on not being the last to pay her respects, and she made a point of Harriet going with her. It seems they're visiting the Eltons because the new Mrs. is has arrived, and she's going to make Harriet go with her. Honestly, it seems a little bit mean. It's like you have to dive in and experience the pain so that it's not as much next time. 252. Um, but the man had only, this is in the middle of that paragraph at the top, but the man had only his own good sense to depend on, and she considered how peculiarly unlucky poor Mr. Elton was in being in the same room at once. This is funny, with the woman he had just married, the woman he had wanted to marry, and the woman whom he had been expected to marry. She must allow him to have the right to look as a little wise and to be as much effectively and a little really easy as he could, and as little really easy as he could be. Well, yes, that's an awkward situation. Um, at the top of page 253, um, and the quarter, so they spend 15 minutes. We are frequently told the duration of these visits, and 15 minutes appears to be what one is expected to commit to when you're calling on someone. And the quarter of an hour quite convinced her that Mrs. Elton was a vain woman, extremely well satisfied with herself, and thinking much of her own importance, that she meant to shine and be very superior, but with manners which were formed in a bad school, pert and familiar, that all her notions were drawn from one set of people and one style of living, and if not foolish, she was ignorant, and that her society would certainly do Mr. Elton no good. Um, Mrs. Elton is, in fact, going to be revealed as somebody who's pretty vulgar. Um, and she refers many, many times to her society in Maple Grove. And then 254, Emma doubted the truth of this sentiment. She had a great idea that people who had extensive grounds themselves, cared very little for the extensive grounds of anybody else. So she's judging Mrs. Elton, who says, "Oh, your property's so lovely," and Emma um, doesn't quite like Mrs. Elton. 255. Um, no, we don't need that. 256. She says, she's a name dropper, and she says, in my Bath life, and we've seen Bath appears quite a lot. It was very popular, and as a resort, and so she's dropping that she's been there. I could immediately secure you some of the best society in the place. And Emma thinks, no thanks. Next paragraph, it was as much as Emma could bear without being impolite. The idea of her being indebted to Mrs. Elton for what was called an introduction. No, thank you, she says to herself. And then, to prevent further outrage and indignation, changed the subject directly. If you go to the top of 257, um, there she refers to her husband as Mr. E, and your note tells you that that is an inappropriate use of address. He should be Mr. Elton, and she does it quite a lot. Um, and at the bottom of 258, she refers to Mr. Knightley as Knightley. Knightley himself. Was not it lucky? For not being within when he called the other day, I had never seen him before. And of course, as so particular a friend of Mr. E's, I had great curiosity. My friend Knightley had been so often mentioned that I was really impatient to see him. And I must do my caro sposo the injustice. Um, and she uses that phrase 3 times. That I think is her, that's her husband. So, but she's, according to the notes, that is an incorrect form of the Italian, which suggests that she's not all that well educated. Next paragraph, she refers to him as Knightley, and she has all her airs of pert pretension and underbred finery. Worse and worse, I never met with her equal. Um, I got to get this weather thing off of here. So at the top of page 260, this is Mr. Woodhouse, I'm pretty sure. Well, my dear, I'm at the bottom of 259. Considering we never saw her before, she seems very pretty sort of young lady, and I dare say she was very much pleased with you. She speaks a little too quick, a little quickness of voice. There is rather what hurts your ear. Yeah, it reminds you of Mrs. Bates, or Miss Bates. I do not like strange voices, and nobody speaks like you. And poor Miss Taylor. Top of 260. Um, he says that it is a social nicety to go and visit the new missus. And at the end of this chapter, at the bottom of 260, Emma had done. Her father was growing nervous and could not understand her. Her mind returned to Mrs. Elton's offenses, and long, very long, did they occupy her. You know how she spins on things. Next chapter. Emma was not required by any subsequent discovery to retract her ill opinion of Mrs. Elton. Um, she is self important, presuming, familiar, ignorant, and ill bred. She had a little beauty and a little accomplishment, but so little judgment that she thought herself coming with a superior knowledge of the world to enliven and improve a country neighborhood, and conceived Miss Hawkins to have held such a place in society as Mrs. Elton's consequence only could surpass. So now we know what Emma thinks. She doesn't like her. She's ill-bred, and she married Elton in order to elevate her status. At the bottom of page 261, in one respect, Mrs. Elton grew even worse than she had appeared at first. Her feelings altered towards Emma, offended probably by the little encouragement which her proposals of intimacy met with. She drew back in return and gradually became more and much more cold and distant. Um, Her manners, too, and Mr. Elton's were unpleasant towards Harriet. They were sneering and negligent. So that's an indicator. Harriet is really vulnerable and not very smart. And so for these two to be rude to Harriet reflects not well on them. Um, Some lines at the bottom of the page are from Thomas Gray, and they are misquoted, again indicating that our education is inadequate. And let's see, at the top of 264, Mrs. Elton says, I think it's in the preceding page, I shall certainly have her very often at my house, and shall introduce her wherever I can, shall have musical parties to draw out her talent. Mrs. Elton is saying this of Jane Fairfax. She's going to be the perpetrator, the giver of opportunities to Jane Fairfax. And she says, and shall be constantly on the watch for an eligible situation. My acquaintance is so very extensive that I have little doubt of hearing something to suit her shortly. So Mrs. Elton is really emphasizing the fact that Jane Fairfax is destined to become a governess. And she has appointed herself as the person who's going to bring her opportunity. Poor Jane Fairfax, thought Emma. You have not deserved this. You may have done wrong with regard to Mr. Dixon. She's still perpetrating that fiction. But this is a punishment beyond which you can have merited. Um, on the top of page 265. Um, she is a riddle, quite a riddle, she said, to choose to remain here month after month under privations of every sort, and now to choose the mortification of Mrs. Elton's notice and the penury of her conversation, rather than return to the superior companions who have always loved her with such real and generous affection. So, in some ways, Emma is participating in the condemnation of Jane. First of all, because she believes that Jane has had an affair with Mr. Dixon, but she's asking why are you not going? Why are you not going to Ireland with the Campbells? It is a riddle. 2 paragraphs. She must have some motive more powerful than appears for refusing this invitation, was Emma's conclusion. She must be under some sort of penance, inflicted either by the Campbells or herself. There is great fear, great caution, great resolution somewhere. She is not to be with the Dixons. The decree is issued by somebody, but why must she consent to be with the Eltons? Here is quite a separate puzzle. And I wrote in margin, exclamation point. Yes, this is a puzzle. And on the next page, towards the top at the end of the first larger paragraph, I should not wonder, said Mrs. Weston, if Miss Fairfax were to have been drawn on beyond her own inclination by her aunt's eagerness in accepting Mrs. Elton's civilities for her. Poor Miss Bates may very likely have committed her niece and hurried her into a greater appearance of intimacy than her own good sense would have dictated, in spite of the very natural wish of a little change. So there doesn't really, aside from the speculation of why Jane is hanging around, so to speak, with the Eltons, it might just be for interest's sake, a little change. Down at the bottom of this page, I know how highly you think of Jane Fairfax, said Emma. Little Henry was in her thoughts. Who's she talking to? Mrs. Elton, and that face to face Mrs. Elton treats her with all the respect which she has claim to. Such a woman as Jane Fairfax probably now never fell in with Mrs. Elton's ways before, and no degree of vanity can prevent her acknowledging her own comparative little action, if not consciousness. So, uh, uh, Emma is again spinning a tale. 267. That will never be, however, I can assure you. Miss Fairfax, I dare say, would not have me if I were to have her, and I am very sure I shall never have her. Um, so Emma kind of blurts out that Mr. Knightley must have his eye on Jane Fairfax, but he says no. So you have been settling that I should marry Jane Fairfax? No, indeed, I have not. You have scolded me too much for matchmaking, and for me to presume to take such a liberty with you. Well, that's in fact what she's speculating. At the end of the next paragraph, Jane Fairfax is a very charming young woman, but not even Jane Fairfax is perfect. She has a fault. She has not the open temper which a man could wish for in a wife. We've heard her described like that before, that she's pretty reserved. Um, she's quite elegant, but perhaps Knightley doesn't, he doesn't value that, her reserves. At the end of this paragraph on 268, well, really, dear Emma, I say that he is so very much occupied by the idea of not being in love with her that I should not wonder if it were to end in his being so at last. Do not hear me. Yes. So it means the opposite of what he actually said. So um, the Eltons entertain a lot of invitations, as might be appropriate for a newly married couple. Um, Paragraph 3, her bath habits made evening parties perfectly natural to her, and Maple Grove had given her taste for dinners. So what she's going to do is throw a very superior dinner. Um, at the top of page 270, um, Jane probably noticed this, not Jane Fairfax, Jane Glazer, that there is another use of the word odious. And I forget the context, I just circled it. She should be exposed to odious suspicions. Emma, in this previous page, Emma, in the meanwhile, could not be satisfied without a dinner at Hartfield for the Eltons. They must not do less than others, or she should be exposed to odious suspicions. Odious suspicions in that she doesn't care for the Eltons. One has to do what one is expected. Um, the day of the party comes on page 271, and then on page 272, we get a little bit of an insight. I have often thought them the worst of the two, replied he coolly. Business, you know, may bring money, but friendship hardly ever does. A little insight into him. Are we talking about? Yeah, I think we're talking about Knightley. She's talking to Knightley. Um, and Knightley is a practical guy. He runs his farm in a practical way. At the top of 273, time will generally lessen the interest of every attachment not within the daily circle. But that is not the change I had in view for you. An old friend, you will allow me to hope, Miss Fairfax, that 10 years hence you may have as many concentrated objects as I have. Um, and then he says in 2 paragraphs, I am very sorry to hear, Miss Fairfax, of your being out this morning in the rain. Um, isn't that funny that everybody knows that Jane has been out in the rain? Um, and she keeps protesting. Well, it's a couple drops, but I think this underscores the terrible fear that people had of getting sick because there was no recourse. And Jane, of course, we know that she perhaps might be more susceptible because perhaps she's had a cold that she never really recovered from, or even TB. Um, Woodhouse says, I wish my health allowed me to be a better neighbor. You do us a great deal of honor today, I am sure. My daughter and I are both highly sensible of your goodness and have the greatest satisfaction in seeing you at Hartfield. So I just thought that this was interesting. If you look on 274, my advice, said Mrs. Weston kindly and persuasively, I certainly do feel tempted to give Miss Fairfax, you must not run such risks, liable as you have been to severe colds. Um, we, it's just interesting to see how people's health was a factor, but no one ever really cares if I'm out in the rain. Doesn't matter. At the bottom, Jane says, I cannot by any means consent to such an arrangement. Um, there, Oh, Mrs. Weston, you and I must be cautious how we express ourselves, but I do flatter myself, my dear Jane, that my influence is not entirely worn out. If I meet with no insuperable difficulties, therefore, consider that point as settled. We often see Mrs. Elton making the assumption that her point is the right one, and she tries to influence people, and Jane is one of the people. And if we look at the end of this chapter, at the top of page 276, Mrs. Weston was disengaged, and Emma began again. Mr. Frank Churchill writes one of the best gentleman hands I've ever seen. And Mr. Knightley says, I do not admire it, said Mr. Knightley. It is too small, wants strength. It is like a woman's writing. And just stash that in the back of your head, that Mr. Knightley is a little condescending about Frank Church. At the bottom of 276, Jane's solicitude about fetching her own letters had not escaped Emma. That's a clue. She had heard and seen it all, and felt some curiosity to know whether the wet walk of this morning had produced any. She suspected that it had, that it would not have been so resolutely encountered, but in full expectation of hearing from some one very dear, and that it was not been in vain. She thought there was an air of greater happiness than usual, a glow both of complexion and spirits. So she thinks that the glow on Jane, the happiness, is from her thoughts about Dixon. This is the second or third time that Emma has speculated that thoughts of Dixon make Jane happy. On the top of page, now it's middle of page 278, Jane had gone off because she had gone out in the rain. Well, actually, it started to drizzle, I think, on the way back. Jane, let's see, it says, the post office, catching cold, fetching letters, and friendships were long under discussion, and to them succeeded one which must be at least equally unpleasant to Jane, inquiries whether she had yet heard of any situation likely to suit her, and professions of Mrs. Elton's meditated activity. And Jane says, no, I have not, and I'm going to stay in my current situation for the summer, 2 months. Um, 279. Thank you, but I would rather you did not mention the subject to her till the time draws near. I do not wish to be giving anybody trouble. So that is a polite way of putting Mrs. Elton off the trail of finding her a position. But it seemed to me that Mrs. Elton is trying to subordinate Jane by putting so much emphasis on her future as a governess. Um, at the end of this page on 279, remember, one of the criticisms of the novel is that it doesn't make mention too often of outside circumstances. And we had one critic say to us that there was no outside mention of the French Revolution and those couple of things because this group wouldn't have addressed that. But the third paragraph up from the bottom, when I am quite determined as to the time, I am not at all afraid of being long unemployed. There are places in town, offices, where inquiries would soon produce something. Offices for sale, not quite of human flesh, but of human intellect. When you are talking about human flesh, but that is a reference to slavery. And slavery was going on at the time. But these people didn't really have slaves, so it's not part of their discussion. She goes on. Oh, my dear, human flesh? You quite shock me. If you mean a fling at the slave trade, I assure you, Mr. Suckling was always rather a friend to abolition. Suckling is her brother, Mrs. Elton's brother. And it's just an awful name, isn't it? Pig. A suckling pig. I did not mean, I was not thinking of the slave trade, replied Jane. Governess trade, I assure you, was all that I had in view. So there's been a parallel here between the position of a governess and a slave trade. And that's an interesting parallel. So I had written in the margin, let's see, widely different certainly as to the guilt of those who carry it on, but as to the greater misery of the victim, I do not know where it lies. Um, a governess was not genteel. It was not a good position, but one took what one could. And it isn't very usual that Mrs. Weston became elevated from the position of the Woodhouse governess to somebody of some position of gentility. That didn't really happen very often. Um, at the bottom of 280, you may well class the delight, the honor, and the comfort of such a situation together, said Jane. They are pretty sure to be equal. However, I am very serious in not wishing anything to be attempted at present for me. I am exceedingly obliged to you, Mrs. Elton. I am obliged to anybody who feels for me, but I am quite serious in wishing nothing to be done till the summer. For 2 or 3 months longer I shall remain where I am and as I am. So she's adamant. And just a tiny little crumb, you could conceive of this as a clue. So just put that in your brain too. She does not want to go anywhere. Um, at the bottom of page 281, John Knightley was only this. John is Knightley's brother, in case you've forgotten. Married to Isabella, they live in London. John Knightley only was in mute astonishment that a man who might have spent his evening quietly at home after a day of business in London should set off again and walk a half a mile to another man's house for the sake of being in mixed company till bedtime, of finishing his day in the efforts of civility and the noise of numbers, was a circumstance to him to strike him deeply. John Knightley can often be a curmudgeon. Kind of, do you know Eeyore, the character in Winnie the Pooh? A curmudgeon. And Knightley's something of that. The top of 282. John Knightley looked at him with amazement, then shrugged his shoulders and said, I could not have believed it even of him. Um, just more of the curmudgeonness. Um, so Mr. Weston announces that Frank is coming back. And at the top of 283, at the end of that first complete paragraph, but Emma could not speak so fluently. She was a little occupied in weighing her own feelings and trying to understand the degree of her agitation, which she rather thought was considerable. So the announcement that Frank's is coming back has set Emma to thinking again. If we run on into the next chapter,